In the last lecture module, we looked at premise and conclusion indicators and logical form words like conditional statements that suggest that a passage written or spoken might contain an argument. In this module, I want to focus on passages that may seem like they contain arguments. We may feel some impetus to accept some conclusion or some statement, but they don't really actually provide us with an argument. That is, they don't really give us reasons which are directly related to an inferential claim to accept some conclusion. And I call these faux arguments. So our first candidate is a warning or a bit of advice taken in isolation. So if I just said to you, if you don't study, you'll do badly on the test. Now, when people offer advice, implicitly, they are suggesting that you take it. But if they don't give you reasons for accepting their advice, they're not giving you an argument. They may be giving you a conclusion, but they're not giving you an argument. And the same story will go for isolated warnings. If someone gives you reasons to accept their advice or reasons to heed their warning, then they might be giving you an argument. But a bit of warning or a bit of advice without that additional information isn't an argument, even though we feel the implied suggestion or the implied social expectation. Our next example are statements of belief or opinions. And so oftentimes when people make statements of their beliefs or their opinions, we feel at least some social pressure to acknowledge their, if not legitimacy, their right to have their opinion. And so again, if someone expresses a strongly held belief, then you might feel as though you have to at least acknowledge that they believe it, even if you don't want to accept it as true. And we may mistake this as reasons for accepting their beliefs when they really haven't given us any. So if we were sitting around in office hours and I said, I'm of the opinion that I'm the best lecturer in the entire university, you may not agree with that at all, but you might well feel a certain amount of social pressure not to, snicker, say, roll your eyes, and so on. Oftentimes when we have a set of loosely associated statements, when we're trying to impose a narrative, then we'll introduce words and phrases that are also used as premise and conclusion indicators, but that function in a manner just to smooth the transition from one moment to the next within the context of the narrative and not to indicate an inference. So I may be talking, there I was atop the mountain, a storm was moving in, hence I sprang into action. Now this sort of provides a narrative structure to these statements, but it doesn't imply an inference being made or offered. What other faux arguments might we consider? Well, reports of facts are often summarized using transitional phrases that, again, suggest wrongly that an inference is being made. So when I used to teach at UBC, the weather report always sort of looked like this. Looks like rain this weekend. More rain on the way. So, wet, wet, wet for the next week or so. Now, the weather person wasn't trying to draw a conclusion. They were just using so to indicate summary instead of inference. Expository and illustrative passages oftentimes seem as though they're arguments because they're offering at least an example. But the purpose of an expository or illustrative passage is to give you a concrete instance of a more abstract principle so that it's easier for you to understand that principle. In and of themselves, they never provide you with sufficient evidence for believing the principle. They just are inadequate in that regard. And so we shouldn't consider these expository or illustrative passages to be arguments, though we'll oftentimes feel like they are, in part because we tend to assign more evidential weight to anecdotal evidence than we should when we're evaluating evidence. So for example, many people think that cows derive their sustenance directly from grass. Take Bill, for example. He doesn't know that cows actually digest the bacteria that eats the grass in their stomachs. So again, this doesn't provide us with any direct evidence that many people do this. Bill is a single individual. It provides us with a concrete instance of this general claim, but it certainly doesn't provide us with enough evidence to think that it's likely to be true. Finally, in the Hurley chapter, he makes a big deal about how explanations aren't arguments. Now, there's a long tradition holding that explanations are arguments, and many explanations do seem to take an argument form. And in fact, in some of the examples in the exercises in the Hurley textbook, he gives an explanation and then he classifies it as an argument. So we want to take this last faux argument with a grain of salt. Some explanations are better understood maybe as not being arguments. Other explanations clearly have an argumentative structure. When we see an explanation, we should evaluate whether or not we think it in fact constitutes an argument and not just immediately assume that it does.